The morning sun cast long shadows across the old railway station as June Matheson dipped her brush into the bucket of gray paint. The metal railings were rusty in places, weathered by years of rain and neglect. She worked slowly and carefully, covering each bar with smooth, even strokes. This was her job now. Painting railings, painting benches, painting the sides of old buildings that belonged to the town council. It was a quiet job, a safe job. Nobody died when you painted railings. June was 51 years old, though most people in Millbrook thought she looked older. Her dark hair had gone mostly gray, and she kept it pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her face had deep lines around her eyes and mouth. These were not laugh lines. They were the marks of someone who had seen something terrible and could not forget it. She had moved to Millbrook 5 years ago, and she had chosen this small town very carefully. It was the kind of place where nothing much happened. The population was barely 2,000 people. There was one main street with a few shops, a post office, a small grocery store, and a diner that served breakfast all day. The railway station where June now worked had been built in the early 20th century, back when Millbrook was more important than it was now. These days, only 2 passenger trains came through Millbrook each day, one in the morning, heading east toward the city, one in the evening, heading west back toward the smaller towns. Most of the time, the station was completely empty. The ticket office had been closed for years. The waiting room was locked. The platform had weeds growing through the cracks in the concrete. June liked the emptiness. She liked working alone. Her supervisor, a man named Tom Henderson, who managed all the public maintenance for the town, would stop by once a week to check on her progress. Otherwise, she saw almost no one. She worked 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. She brought her lunch in a simple brown bag. She ate sitting on one of the benches she had painted the previous month. She never listened to music while she worked. She never talked on the phone. She just painted, slowly and carefully, one stroke at a time.
The people of Millbrook knew very little about June Matheson. They knew she lived in a small rental house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the center of town. They knew she kept to herself. They knew she did her job well. Mrs. Chen at the grocery store knew that June bought simple food and never much of it. Rice, vegetables, chicken, bread, tea. Mr. Walsh at the post office knew that June never received personal mail, only bills and occasional magazines about gardening. At the diner, a woman named Rita, who had worked there for 30 years, knew that June came in for breakfast every Saturday morning. She always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs, scrambled, with toast and black coffee. She always sat in the same booth by the window. She always left exactly a 20% tip. She never stayed longer than 30 minutes.
Some of the townspeople wondered about her. There was something in the way June held herself, something in her eyes that suggested she was running from something, or hiding from something. But Millbrook was a town that respected privacy. People here believed that if someone wanted to talk about their past, they would. If they did not want to talk about it, that was their business. June preferred it this way. She had chosen Millbrook because it was far from everything she had been before, far from the city, far from the trains that had once been her whole life, far from the memories that still woke her up at night, heart pounding, sheets soaked with sweat. Well, not entirely far from trains. The railway line still ran through Millbrook, but these were different trains. Slower trains, quieter trains, and June was not responsible for them. She just painted railings near them, and that was completely different. Or so she told herself.
On this particular morning in late September, June had been working at the station for 3 weeks. Her job was to paint all the metal railings along the platform, then move on to the old wooden benches, and finally to paint the exterior walls of the small station building. It was a big project. Tom Henderson had told her it would probably take until the end of October to finish everything. June did not mind. She liked having a project that would last. It meant she did not have to think about what would come next. She worked her way along the railing, section by section. The paint was thick and covered well, even over the rust. She had prepared the surface carefully first, scraping away the loose rust and treating the metal with primer. That was the kind of work she did now. Careful work. Methodical work. Work where if you made a mistake, the worst thing that happened was you had to do it over again. Around 11 o'clock, she heard the distant sound of the morning eastbound train. She glanced up from her work and saw it approaching in the distance, a small passenger train with 4 cars. It was right on time, as it always was. June watched as it slowed down, pulled into the station, and stopped. 3 people got off. 1 person got on. The train stayed for exactly 2 minutes, then pulled away again, gathering speed as it headed toward the city. June watched it disappear around the bend in the tracks. Then she dipped her brush back into the paint bucket and continued working. By noon, she had finished 1 complete side of the platform railing. She washed her brush carefully in the bucket of water she kept nearby, then sat down on a bench to eat her lunch. She had brought a sandwich made with leftover chicken and lettuce. She ate it slowly, looking out at the empty tracks and the fields beyond. The station was at the edge of town, and from here you could see open countryside in every direction. In the distance were gentle hills covered with trees that were just beginning to turn colors. The sky was blue and clear. A few birds flew overhead. It was peaceful. June tried to let the peacefulness settle into her bones. She tried to let it quiet the constant noise in her mind, the endless loop of memories and what-ifs that had been playing for 5 years. But peace was hard to find. It always had been, since that day. She finished her sandwich and checked her watch. She had 30 minutes left for lunch. She stood up and walked slowly along the platform, stretching her legs. The station building was old but sturdy, built from red brick with white trim around the windows. It had a sloping roof and a small chimney. In its day, it must have been quite charming. Now it just looked abandoned. June walked to the far end of the platform and looked down the tracks. They ran perfectly straight for about a mile before curving away to the east. In the other direction, they curved more quickly, disappearing into a small wooded area about a quarter mile away. This stretch of track was used by both passenger trains and freight trains. The freight trains came through at night, usually carrying goods to and from the city. June never saw them. By the time they passed through Millbrook, she was at home, in bed, trying to sleep. She stood there for a few more minutes, just looking at the tracks. Part of her mind, the part that had been trained for years in railway operations, automatically noted details. The condition of the rails, the spacing of the ties, the angle of the signals in the distance. Even after 5 years away from the job, she still saw these things. She still processed them. It was like a language she had once spoken fluently and could not entirely forget. Finally, she turned away and walked back to her paint bucket. The afternoon stretched ahead of her. 3 more hours of work. 3 more hours of steady, mindless painting. 3 more hours of trying not to think. She picked up her brush and began again. June Matheson had not always been a painter. There had been a time when she wore a uniform and carried responsibility and made decisions that affected hundreds of people every day. She had been a railway traffic controller for 23 years. It had been her dream job. Even as a child growing up in the city, she had been fascinated by trains. She loved everything about them: the sound of their horns, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails, the way they connected places and people, the complex system that kept them running on time. Her parents had not understood her interest. They had wanted her to become a teacher or a nurse. something practical and respectable for a woman. But June had been stubborn. After finishing school, she had enrolled in a technical program for railway operations. She had excelled in her classes. She had learned about signals and switches, about timetables and safety protocols, about all the thousands of details that went into running a safe and efficient railway system. At 22, she had gotten her first job as a junior controller at a small station outside the city. She had worked hard, learned everything she could, and slowly moved up. By the time she was 30, she was a senior controller at Central Station, one of the busiest railway hubs in the country. She had loved her work, absolutely loved it. Every day was like conducting an orchestra. You had passenger trains and freight trains, express trains and local trains, all needing to move through the station and along the network at the right times. You had to track them, coordinate them, adjust schedules when there were delays, make quick decisions when something went wrong. It required constant attention and absolute precision. One small mistake could cause delays for thousands of passengers. One serious mistake could cause a disaster. June had been very good at her job. In 23 years, she had never made a serious mistake. Her record was perfect. Her supervisors praised her. Her colleagues respected her. She had received commendations for her work. She had trained new controllers. She had helped design new safety procedures. She had been proud of what she did. And then came that Tuesday in October, 5 years ago. It had started as a normal morning. June had arrived at Central Station at 6 in the morning to start her shift. The control room was a large space filled with monitors and computers, showing the positions of every train in the network. There were 6 controllers on duty that morning, each responsible for different sections of track. June was in charge of the Northeastern Corridor, a busy stretch of track that carried both passenger and freight traffic. That morning, she was tracking 12 trains that would pass through her section during her shift. Everything went smoothly for the first 2 hours. Trains departed on time. They moved through her section according to schedule. At 8:15, she cleared a passenger train to proceed through a junction. At 8:30, she stopped a freight train at a signal to let an express passenger train pass. At 9 o'clock, her supervisor asked her to cover for a colleague who needed to take a break. This was normal. Controllers often helped each other out. June took over responsibility for an additional section of track, the Southern Corridor. Now she was watching both the Northeastern Corridor and the Southern Corridor. It was busy, but manageable. June was experienced. She had done this many times before. At 9:20, she noticed that a freight train on the Southern Corridor was running 10 minutes behind schedule. This was not unusual. Freight trains often fell behind. The important thing was to make sure the delay did not affect passenger trains. She checked the schedule. There was a passenger train due to cross the freight train's path in 15 minutes. She would need to hold the freight train at a signal until the passenger train passed. At 9:30, she sent the signal to hold the freight train. The freight train acknowledged and began to slow down. At 9:35, the passenger train passed through the junction as scheduled. Everything was going according to plan. But what June did not know was that there was a problem with the signal system on the Southern Corridor. A technical fault that had developed overnight. The signal she had sent to hold the freight train had been received. But another signal, one she had not sent, had also been activated. This second signal told the freight train that the track ahead was clear. The computer system was showing June that the freight train had stopped at the signal. But in reality, the freight train had received contradictory signals and was still moving. At 9:40, June cleared another passenger train to enter the Southern Corridor from the opposite direction. This passenger train was the Morning Express from Ridgeway, a town about 60 miles south of the city. It carried 237 passengers that morning. Most of them were commuters heading to work. Some were students. Some were elderly people going to visit family. The train was traveling at 75 miles per hour. At 9:42, June's colleague returned from his break. He looked at his monitors and immediately saw something wrong. He saw that the freight train was still moving. He saw the passenger train approaching from the other direction. He saw that they were on the same track. He shouted. June looked up. For a moment, she did not understand what she was seeing. The computer was telling her the freight train had stopped, but her colleague was pointing at a different monitor, one that showed the actual positions of the trains using GPS tracking. The freight train had not stopped. The two trains were less than a mile apart, both traveling toward each other, on the same track. June's hands moved faster than her mind. She hit the emergency stop button for both trains. She sent out the emergency signal. She activated the collision warning system, but it was too late. The two trains were too close. They were traveling too fast. Even with emergency braking, they could not stop in time. June watched on the monitors as the distance between the trains shrank. 1,000 meters, 800 meters, 500 meters. She could not breathe. She could not think. She could only watch. At 9:44 in the morning, the two trains collided. The sound reached the control room even though they were miles away. A deep, terrible boom that shook the building. June stared at the monitors. For a few seconds, there was just silence in the control room. Complete silence. Then the alarms started going off. Emergency calls started coming in. The other controllers began moving, making calls, sending emergency services to the site. June sat frozen in her chair. She understood what had happened. She understood that she had cleared the passenger train to enter a section of track where another train was still moving. She understood that she had trusted the computer system when she should have double-checked with visual confirmation. She understood that she had just caused a disaster. Someone was pulling her out of her chair. Someone was talking to her. But she could not hear them. She could not hear anything except the sound of that boom echoing in her mind. Later, she learned the details. She learned that 43 people had died in the collision. More than 100 were injured. The freight train, which was carrying metal pipes, had crashed into the front cars of the passenger train. The passenger cars had been crushed. People had been thrown from their seats. The wreckage had caught fire. Later, she learned that the investigation had revealed the fault in the signal system. She learned that the accident had not been entirely her fault. The signal system had failed. It had sent contradictory information. The freight train driver had made an error in judgment when he received the contradictory signals. There were multiple factors that contributed to the accident, but June also learned that she had made mistakes too. She should have been more careful when covering two sections at once. She should have double-checked the freight train's position when she cleared the passenger train. She should have noticed the discrepancy between different monitoring systems. The investigation concluded that the accident was the result of multiple failures, both technical and human. June Matheson was one of the humans who had failed. The railway company did not fire her. The investigation had not found her solely responsible. They offered her counseling. They offered her time off to recover. They told her that everyone understood it had been a terrible accident. But June could not continue. She could not sit in that control room anymore. She could not look at those monitors. She could not make decisions about trains. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the two trains moving toward each other on the screen. Every time she tried to sleep, she heard that boom. She resigned from her job 3 weeks after the accident. She stopped leaving her apartment. She stopped answering her phone. She stopped seeing her friends and family. For months, she barely functioned. She would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, convinced she could smell smoke. She would have panic attacks in the grocery store when she heard loud noises. She would see trains in her dreams, crashing over and over again. A doctor diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder. He prescribed medication. He recommended therapy. June went to a therapist for 6 months. The therapist helped her understand that trauma changes the brain, that what she was experiencing was a normal response to an abnormal event, that she needed to be patient with herself. But June did not feel patient. She felt guilty. She felt like she had blood on her hands. 43 people had died, and she had been one of the people responsible. How was she supposed to live with that? The therapist said she needed to forgive herself, but June did not know how. After a year, she decided she needed to start over completely. She needed to go somewhere where no one knew what had happened, somewhere where she would not see trains every day, somewhere quiet and small and safe. She researched small towns all over the country. She looked for places that were far from major railway lines, places where she could live simply and anonymously. That was how she found Millbrook. It was perfect, small, quiet, remote, and it had a railway line that ran through it, but just a minor one, with only local trains. She told herself she could handle that. It would actually be good for her, the therapist had said, to gradually expose herself to trains again. Not to work with them, but just to be around them, to prove to herself that she could be near trains without falling apart. So she had packed up her apartment, sold most of her belongings, and moved to Millbrook. She had found a small house to rent. She had found a simple job with the town maintenance department. She had started her new life. That had been 4 years ago. For 4 years, she had lived quietly. She had painted railings and benches and walls. She had kept to herself. She had tried to build a life that was so simple and so small that nothing could go wrong. And most of the time, it worked. Most of the time, she could get through the day without thinking too much about the past. She still had nightmares sometimes. She still felt a wave of anxiety when she heard a train horn. But she was managing. She was surviving. She told herself that was enough.
The house June rented was small and plain, but it was hers. It stood on a quiet street lined with maple trees. The house itself was white with blue shutters, and it had a small front porch with 2 steps leading up to the door. There was a tiny yard in front with some grass and a few bushes. June did not do much with the yard. She kept the grass mowed and the bushes trimmed, but that was all. Inside, the house had just 3 rooms downstairs and 2 rooms upstairs. Downstairs was a living room, a kitchen, and a small bathroom. Upstairs was a bedroom and another room that June used for storage. The furniture was simple: a couch and a chair in the living room, a small table with 2 chairs in the kitchen, a bed and a dresser in the bedroom. June did not decorate much. There were no paintings on the walls, no photographs, no knickknacks on the shelves. She liked keeping things simple. The less stuff she had, the less there was to remind her of anything. Her daily routine was simple too. She woke up at 6:30 every morning. She made herself breakfast, usually toast and tea. She read the newspaper while she ate. Then she walked to work. It was a 20-minute walk from her house to wherever she was working that week. She did not own a car. She did not need one in a town this small. She worked from 8 to 4, with a half hour for lunch. After work, she walked home. She made herself a simple dinner. She read for a while, or worked in the small vegetable garden she had started in the backyard. She went to bed at 9:30. On Saturdays, she did her grocery shopping in the morning and went to the diner for breakfast. In the afternoon, she did laundry and cleaned the house. On Sundays, she usually worked in the garden or went for a long walk on the trails outside of town. It was not an exciting life, but it was peaceful, and peace was what June needed. The people of Millbrook were kind to her in a distant sort of way. They said hello when they passed her on the street. They made small talk at the grocery store, but they did not pry. They did not ask personal questions. They seemed to sense that June preferred to keep her distance. There were a few people she interacted with more regularly. Tom Henderson, her supervisor, was a friendly man in his 60s. He had lived in Millbrook his whole life and knew everyone in town. He checked on June's work once a week and always had something cheerful to say about the weather or the local football team. June appreciated that he never asked her about her past. Rita at the diner was another regular presence in June's life. Rita was a large woman with short gray hair and a quick smile. She had been working at the diner for 30 years and seemed to know everything about everyone in Millbrook. But she was discreet with June. She would bring her coffee and eggs without being asked, make a comment about how cold it was getting or how the leaves were beautiful this year, and then move on to other customers. Mrs. Chen at the grocery store was always polite and efficient. She would ring up June's groceries, mention if there was a sale on something June bought regularly, and wish her a good day. These small interactions were enough for June. She did not want deep friendships. She did not want people asking about her life or expecting her to share things. She just wanted these simple, surface-level connections that let her feel like she was part of the world without actually having to be too much a part of it. Sometimes, on her walks, she would pass the elementary school and see children playing in the schoolyard. Their laughter would drift across the fence, high and bright. June would watch them for a moment, these small people who knew nothing about train crashes or guilt or nightmares. She envied their innocence. On her walks through the countryside, she would sometimes stop and sit on a fallen log or a large rock and just look at the landscape, the rolling hills, the forests, the streams. It was beautiful country. June tried to let the beauty sink into her, tried to let it ease some of the darkness she carried. But beauty alone could not heal what was broken inside her.
She still had the nightmares. 2 or 3 times a week, she would wake up in the dark, her heart pounding, the sound of that crash echoing in her ears. Sometimes she dreamed she was back in the control room, watching the monitors, trying to stop the trains but unable to move her hands. Sometimes she dreamed she was on one of the trains, feeling the moment of impact. Sometimes she dreamed of the faces of the victims, faces she had seen in the news reports, staring at her with accusation in their eyes. After these nightmares, she would lie awake for hours, unable to go back to sleep. She would get up and make tea and sit in the dark kitchen, waiting for morning. The medication the doctor had prescribed helped a little. It took the edge off the anxiety. It made the panic attacks less frequent. But it could not take away the guilt. The therapist she had seen in the city had told her that guilt was a normal response to trauma. That feeling responsible was part of the healing process. That over time, she would be able to put what happened in perspective. But June was not sure she believed that. How could she put 43 deaths in perspective? How could she ever say that what happened was okay, that she could forgive herself, that she could move on? Those people had gotten on a train one Tuesday morning, expecting to arrive safely at their destination. They had families who loved them. They had plans for their future. And because of a series of errors, June's included, they never came home. How did you forgive yourself for that? June did not have an answer. So instead, she painted railings. She kept her life small and quiet. She tried not to think too much. And she told herself that this was enough. This was all she could manage. The weeks passed. Summer turned to autumn. The trees around Millbrook blazed with color, brilliant reds and oranges and yellows. The air grew cooler. People started wearing jackets and sweaters. June continued her work at the train station. She finished painting all the railings along the platform. She moved on to the wooden benches, scraping off the old paint and applying fresh coats. The work was repetitive and soothing. Sometimes when she was working, she would hear a train coming. She would stop and watch it pass through the station. These were small, local trains. Nothing like the big express trains that had been involved in the crash. Watching them did not trigger her anxiety as much as she had feared it might. In fact, sometimes watching the trains was almost peaceful. They moved so steadily, so predictably. The rails guided them. The signals controlled them. Everything working as it should. June tried to take comfort in that. Most of the time, the system worked. Most of the time, trains ran safely. What had happened that day 5 years ago was rare. Tragic, but rare. She tried to believe that, but deep down, she knew the truth. Rare or not, it had happened, and she had been part of it, and nothing could ever change that. October came to Millbrook with cold mornings and bright afternoons. The leaves were at their peak now, creating a canopy of gold and crimson over the streets. Children walked to school bundled in jackets, their breath making small clouds in the morning air. In the evenings, people started lighting fires in their fireplaces, and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the town. June had finished painting the benches at the train station and had moved on to the exterior walls of the station building itself. This was more challenging work. The brick walls needed to be cleaned first, then repaired in places where the mortar had crumbled. Only after that could she paint the white trim around the windows and doors. Tom Henderson had told her to take her time with this part of the project. "The building has stood for over 100 years," he said with a smile. "It can wait another few weeks for a fresh coat of paint." June appreciated the lack of pressure. She worked methodically, scrubbing the bricks with a stiff brush, mixing mortar for the repairs, carefully painting the trim with a small brush. The work required attention to detail, which suited her. It kept her mind occupied. It was a Thursday morning in mid-October when June first noticed the school bus. She was working on the north side of the station building, painting the trim around a tall window. The morning train had passed through an hour ago. The station was empty and quiet. June was concentrating on getting the paint exactly right in the corner where two pieces of trim met. That was when she heard the sound of an engine struggling. She looked up and saw a yellow school bus coming down the road that ran parallel to the train tracks. The bus was old and looked like it had seen better days. It was making a loud coughing noise, and as June watched, it slowed down and then stopped right next to where the road crossed the railroad tracks. June set down her paintbrush and watched. The bus sat there for a moment. The engine coughed a few more times. Then it went silent. The driver got out. He was a young man, maybe in his early 20s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. He opened the hood of the bus and peered inside. Then he scratched his head and pulled out his phone. June could see that there were children on the bus. She could see their faces looking out the windows. They seemed more curious than worried. This was probably just a minor adventure for them. The driver talked on his phone for a few minutes. Then he climbed back into the bus. June assumed he had called for help and would wait there until someone arrived to fix the bus or bring another one. She picked up her paintbrush and went back to work. But something was bothering her. She glanced over at the bus again. It was stopped right on the railroad crossing. The front of the bus was past the tracks, but the rear of the bus was still on the tracks. June felt a small flutter of anxiety in her chest. She told herself it was fine. The bus would be moved soon. Help was probably already on the way. She focused on her painting. But her hand was not quite steady now. She kept thinking about the bus, about the fact that it was sitting on the tracks, about the fact that there were children on that bus. She told herself that the driver knew what he was doing. He would move the bus if there was any danger. And anyway, the next train was not due through for hours. The westbound train did not come through until 6 in the evening. Except... June froze, her paintbrush in mid-stroke. Except that was not entirely true. There was the freight train. June had been working at the station for weeks now, and she had learned the schedule. The 2 passenger trains were predictable. one at 9 in the morning, one at 6 in the evening. But there was also a freight train that came through in the middle of the day. It did not come every day, only on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today was Thursday, and the freight train did not stop at Millbrook Station. It was an express freight train carrying manufactured goods to the city. It came through at high speed, usually around 1 in the afternoon. June looked at her watch. It was 11:45. The freight train would be here in about an hour and 15 minutes. June looked back at the bus. It was still sitting on the tracks. The driver was still inside, presumably waiting for help to arrive. June told herself that help would arrive soon. Someone would come and tow the bus or fix it. The driver had called for help. Everything would be fine. But what if help did not come in time? What if the tow truck was delayed? What if the driver did not know about the freight train? Millbrook was a small town. The bus driver was young. He might not know the train schedule. He might not know that there was a freight train coming. June felt her heart starting to beat faster. She tried to calm herself. She was being paranoid. This was just her anxiety talking. The bus driver was a professional. He knew what he was doing. And even if he did not move the bus in time, surely the train would see the bus on the tracks and stop. Except freight trains could not stop quickly. She knew that. A freight train traveling at high speed needed a long distance to stop, much longer than most people realized. June's hands were shaking now. She set down her paintbrush. She told herself to stay calm, to breathe, to not panic. But her mind was already calculating. The freight train would come around the bend in the tracks about a quarter mile from the station. It would be traveling at maybe 50 or 60 miles per hour. The engineer would have only seconds to see the bus on the tracks. Even if he applied the emergency brakes immediately, the train would not stop in time. June felt cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. She was being ridiculous. She was letting her trauma make her see danger where there was none. But what if she was right? She looked at the bus again. The children were still sitting inside. She could see a little girl with braids looking out the window. She could see a boy with glasses. She could see the driver still on his phone. June made a decision. She put down her paint bucket and walked across the platform toward the bus. As June walked toward the railroad crossing, she tried to organize her thoughts. She did not want to alarm anyone unnecessarily. Maybe the bus would be fine. Maybe help was already on the way. Maybe she was worrying for nothing. But she needed to check. She needed to make sure. The bus driver saw her approaching and opened the door. He was a young man with sandy hair and a friendly face. He looked a bit stressed, but not particularly worried. "Hi there," he said. "Sorry about the bus. Engine just quit on us." "Are you getting help?" June asked. Her voice sounded calmer than she felt. "Yeah, I called the garage. They said they would send someone out. Should be here soon." "How soon?" June asked. The driver shrugged. "They said maybe 30 minutes. We will be fine. The kids are not worried." He smiled back at the children on the bus. Some of them waved at June. June felt her chest tighten. 30 minutes. That would be 12:15. The freight train would be here around 1 o'clock. There would be time, but not much. "Do you know about the train schedule?" June asked. The driver looked confused. "Train schedule?" "There is a freight train that comes through here on Tuesdays and Thursdays," June said. She was trying to keep her voice level, but she could hear it starting to shake. "It comes through around 1 o'clock, and it does not stop. It is an express freight." The driver's expression changed. He looked down at the tracks under his bus, then back at June. "A freight train?" Today is Thursday," June said. "Oh." The driver pulled out his phone and checked the time. "Okay. Well, help should be here by 12:15. We will be off the tracks by then." "What if they are delayed?" June asked. The driver frowned. "I am sure they will be here on time." "Bob at the garage is pretty reliable." June wanted to believe him. She wanted to just nod and walk away and let him handle it, but she could not. "I think you should move the children off the bus," she said, "just to be safe." The driver looked at her more carefully now. "Move them off? Where?" "Into the station, or just away from the tracks." June gestured toward the platform, "just until the bus is fixed." "Look, I appreciate your concern," the driver said, his tone becoming a bit defensive. "But I think we are okay. Help is on the way. I do not want to scare the kids by making them get off the bus for no reason." June felt frustration rising in her chest. "It is not for no reason. There is a train coming. If your bus is not moved in time, those children will be in danger." "The help will be here in time," the driver said firmly. "I am sure of it." June looked past him at the children on the bus. There were about 20 of them, ranging in age from maybe 6 to 12 years old. They were watching the conversation with interest. Some of them looked a bit nervous now. She looked back at the driver. "What if you are wrong?" "I am not wrong," the driver said. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes now. June took a breath. She knew she was probably coming across as some crazy, paranoid woman. But she also knew what could happen when people underestimated the danger of trains. "My name is June Matheson," she said. "I used to work in railway traffic control. I know how trains work. And I am telling you that if that freight train comes around that bend and sees your bus on the tracks, it will not be able to stop in time." The driver stared at her. "You worked in railway traffic control?" "For 23 years, June said. The driver was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Why did you stop?" June felt a wave of emotion hit her. She did not want to talk about this. She did not want to explain. But she needed him to understand. "Because I made a mistake," she said quietly. "And people died. And I do not want that to happen again." The driver's expression softened. He looked at the children behind him, then back at June. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, I will move the kids off the bus." Relief flooded through June. "Thank you." The driver turned to the children. "All right, everyone. We are going to get off the bus and wait over by the station. Bring your backpacks. Single file, please." The children started to gather their things. Some of them looked confused. A few looked excited about the unexpected adventure. "Why are we getting off?" a little girl asked. "Just a safety precaution," the driver said with a smile. "We are going to wait for the tow truck over there where we have more room." June watched as the children filed off the bus. She counted them. 22 children in total. They ranged from small first graders to bigger kids who were probably in 6th grade. The driver led them over to the platform. June followed. "You can wait in the waiting area," June said, pointing to the covered section of the platform with benches. "It is more comfortable there." "Thanks," the driver said. He seemed embarrassed now. "I am sorry. I should have thought about the train schedule myself." "It is okay," June said. "You did the right thing by moving them." The children settled on the benches, some of them chatting, some of them playing games on their phones. The driver stood with them, keeping an eye on the empty bus still sitting on the tracks. June checked her watch. It was 12 o'clock, 1 hour until the freight train came through. June walked back to her work area and tried to focus on painting again. But her hands were still shaking. She kept glancing over at the bus. At 12:15, a tow truck arrived. The driver from the garage, a middle-aged man in overalls, got out and walked over to the school bus. He popped the hood and looked at the engine. June watched from where she was working. The tow truck driver was talking to the school bus driver, pointing at different parts of the engine. 12:30. The tow truck driver was still working on the bus. 12:45. The tow truck driver got into the school bus and tried to start it. The engine turned over but did not catch. 12:50. The tow truck driver shook his head and walked back to his truck. He came back with a towing cable. June felt her anxiety rising again. It was taking too long. They needed to move that bus. 1 o'clock was approaching fast. The tow truck driver attached the cable to the front of the school bus. Then he got into his truck and started pulling. The school bus began to move forward, slowly. June watched, holding her breath. The bus moved about 10 feet. Then it stopped. The tow truck kept pulling, but the bus would not budge. The tow truck driver got out. He walked back to look at the bus. Then June saw him point at the rear wheels. The brakes had locked. The bus could not be towed. June felt panic rising in her chest. She looked at her watch. 12:55. The train would be here in 5 minutes. She looked down the tracks. She could not see it yet, but she knew it was coming. The tow truck driver and the school bus driver were talking, both of them looking stressed now. The tow truck driver was on his phone, probably calling for another tow truck or for instructions. But there was no time. June looked at the children sitting on the platform. They were safe. That was the important thing. The children were safe. But the bus was still on the tracks, and the train was coming. And if the train hit the bus, the derailment could be catastrophic. The train could jump the tracks and crash into the station building, into the platform, into the children. June felt like she could not breathe. This was happening again. It was not as bad as before, but it was happening again. And this time, she was the only one who could stop it.
June ran. She ran toward the signal box. She had noticed it weeks ago when she first started working at the station. It was a small metal box mounted on a pole about 50 yards down the track. Signal boxes like this controlled the railway signals and switches in the area. Most modern systems were automated, but older stations like Millbrook still had manual override controls for emergencies. June knew how these systems worked. She had been trained on them years ago. She hoped desperately that this one still functioned. As she ran, she heard a sound in the distance. A train horn. The freight train was approaching. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Her legs felt weak. Everything in her body was telling her to stop, to hide, to run away from the trains and the danger and the terrible responsibility. But she kept running. She reached the signal box. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the latch. She pulled open the metal door. Inside were switches and levers and dials, all labeled with codes and numbers. June's mind raced. She needed to activate the emergency stop signal. She needed to tell the train to brake immediately. She scanned the controls. There it was. The red lever marked emergency. But she hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if this was not the right control? What if activating the emergency stop on an express freight train caused a different kind of accident? The train horn sounded again, louder now. June looked down the track and saw the freight train coming around the bend. There was no more time. She pulled the emergency lever. Immediately, red lights began flashing on the signal pole. An alarm started blaring. The system was working. But would the train stop in time? June ran back toward the platform. The school bus driver and the tow truck driver had heard the alarm and were staring at the approaching train. "Get away from the tracks!" June shouted at them. "Get to the platform!" They ran. June reached the platform where the children were. The school bus driver was there, trying to keep the children calm, but some of them had started to cry. They could hear the train horn now. They could see the train approaching. "Everyone move to the far end of the platform," June shouted. "Away from the tracks." The children started moving. Some of them were scared now, running. The bus driver tried to keep them together. June stood at the edge of the platform, watching the train. It was slowing down. She could see it. The engineer had seen the emergency signal and was applying the brakes, but it was not slowing down fast enough.
The train was huge, at least 40 cars long, carrying shipping containers stacked too high. It weighed hundreds of tons. Even with full emergency braking, its momentum was enormous. June did the math in her head. The distance from the signal to the crossing, the speed of the train, the braking distance needed. It was going to be close. So close. The train horn was constant now, a long wailing blast. The engineer was warning everyone to stay clear. The brakes were screaming, metal on metal, as the train tried desperately to stop. June watched, unable to breathe, unable to move. The train was 50 yards from the crossing, 40 yards, 30. It was not going to stop in time. 20 yards. June closed her eyes. She heard the impact. A tremendous crash of metal hitting metal, the sound of shattering glass and bending steel, the screech of the train's wheels sliding on the rails. Then silence. June opened her eyes. The train had stopped.
The front engine was about 15 feet past the crossing. The school bus was gone. It had been knocked off the tracks and was lying on its side in the ditch beside the road. It was crushed and mangled, but the train itself had not derailed. June's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the platform. The children were safe. The train had stopped. Nobody was hurt. She had stopped it in time. Barely, but in time. She sat there, shaking, as the world seemed to spin around her. People were running now. The school bus driver, the tow truck driver. Tom Henderson had arrived from somewhere, shouting into his phone. In the distance, she could hear sirens. But June just sat there. She had done it. She had faced her worst fear, and she had done it. For the first time in 5 years, she had saved people instead of failing them. The next few hours were a blur.
Police arrived. Firefighters arrived. An ambulance came, even though no one was injured. The train engineer climbed down from his cab, shaking and pale. The railway company sent investigators. The school district sent supervisors. Everyone had questions. June sat on a bench on the platform and answered them as best she could. She explained what she had seen. She explained why she had moved the children off the bus. She explained how she had activated the emergency signal. The police officer taking her statement looked impressed. "You probably saved a lot of lives today, ma'am." June did not know how to respond to that. Tom Henderson sat beside her while she gave her statement. He kept asking if she was okay. June said she was, even though she was not sure if that was true. The children were picked up by their parents over the course of the afternoon. The parents hugged their children tightly. Some of them came over to thank June. She accepted their thanks with awkward nods, not knowing what to say. The school bus driver came over too. "I am sorry I did not listen to you right away," he said. "Thank you for insisting." "You did listen," June said. "You moved the children when I asked." That is what mattered. He shook her hand and left. By late afternoon, most people had gone. The damaged school bus had been towed away. The freight train had been cleared to continue its journey, though at reduced speed. The railway investigators had finished their initial examination of the scene. Tom Henderson drove June home. She sat in the passenger seat staring out the window, not really seeing anything. "You should be proud of yourself," Tom said. "What you did was incredible." June did not answer. When they reached her house, Tom walked her to the door. "Take tomorrow off," he said. "Rest. You have been through a lot today." June thanked him and went inside. She sat in her living room in the growing darkness and tried to process what had happened. She had faced the things she feared most. She had been near trains making critical safety decisions. She had been responsible for preventing an accident, and she had succeeded. She thought about the crash 5 years ago, the one that had destroyed her career and her life, the one that still haunted her dreams. She could not change what had happened that day. Those 43 people were still gone. Her mistakes were still real. But today, 22 children had gone home safe to their families. Today, she had made the right decisions. Maybe that did not erase the past. Maybe nothing could ever erase it. But maybe, just maybe, it meant she was not completely defined by that one terrible day. Maybe there was more to her story than just the accident. June sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about this. Finally, she stood up and made herself some tea. She turned on a lamp. She sat down with a book. For the first time in 5 years, she felt something other than guilt and fear. She felt a small, fragile sense of hope. The story spread through Millbrook quickly. By the next morning, everyone in town knew what had happened. June discovered this when she went to the diner for her usual Saturday breakfast. When she walked in, the entire room went quiet for a moment. Then Rita came over with a huge smile on her face. "There is our hero," she announced loudly. The other customers started clapping. June felt her face turn red. She wanted to disappear. She was not a hero. She had just done what needed to be done. But Rita would not let her sit quietly in her usual booth. She made June sit at the counter so people could come over and talk to her. Farmer Joe, who always sat in the corner, came over to shake her hand. Mrs. Patterson from the library came to thank her on behalf of all the parents in town. Even some teenagers who June had never spoken to before came over to say she was awesome. June endured it all with as much grace as she could manage. She understood that people meant well. But the attention made her deeply uncomfortable. After breakfast, she walked home through town and discovered that people kept stopping her on the street to thank her or congratulate her. It took her twice as long as usual to get home. When she finally reached her house, she went inside and closed the door with relief. But the phone was ringing. It was Tom Henderson. "June, I am sorry to bother you on your day off," he said. "But there is a reporter from the regional newspaper who wants to talk to you about what happened. And the railway company has called. They want to give you some kind of commendation. And the school district wants to do something to thank you." June felt overwhelmed. "I do not want any of that," she said. "I figured you would say that," Tom said gently. "But you should probably at least talk to the railway company." They were pretty insistent. June agreed, reluctantly. On Monday, a representative from the railway company came to Millbrook. He was a serious man in a suit who introduced himself as Mr. Morris, Director of Safety Operations. They met at the town hall with Tom Henderson present. Mr. Morris shook June's hand warmly. "Ms. Matheson, what you did was extraordinary," he said. "You prevented what could have been a serious accident. The company wants to recognize your quick thinking and your expertise." "I just did what anyone with my training would have done," June said. "That is precisely the point," Mr. Morris said. "Very few people have your training and experience, and even fewer would have had the presence of mind to act so decisively in an emergency." He paused. "We have looked into your background. We know you used to work for us as a traffic controller." June tensed. Here it came. They knew about the accident. They knew about her past. "We also know about the Ridgeway accident," Mr. Morris continued quietly. "And we know that you resigned afterwards." June could not look at him. She stared at her hands. "Ms. Matheson," Mr. Morris said, his voice kind. "That accident was investigated thoroughly. The findings were clear. It was caused by multiple system failures and human errors, not all of which were under your control. You were one of several people who shared responsibility, but you were also dealing with faulty equipment and inadequate protocols." "People still died," June said quietly. "Yes," Mr. Morris agreed. "They did. And that is a terrible burden to carry. But what you did on Thursday shows that you still have exceptional skill and judgment. You saw a dangerous situation developing. You took appropriate action. You saved lives. June did not know what to say. Mr. Morris reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. The company would like to offer you our highest civilian safety commendation. We would also like to offer you your old job back if you are interested, or a different position with the company if you would prefer. June looked up at him in shock. My old job? We need people with your experience and your dedication to safety, Mr. Morris said. What happened 5 years ago was a tragedy. But it does not mean your career has to be over. You have proven that you still have what it takes. June felt emotions welling up inside her. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately. She missed that work. She missed feeling competent and skilled. She missed being part of something important. But another part of her was terrified. What if she made another mistake? What if she failed again? I need time to think about it, she said. Of course, Mr. Morris said. Take all the time you need. The offer stands. He gave her his business card and the envelope with the commendation. Then he shook her hand again and left. June sat there with Tom, holding the envelope. Are you going to take it? Tom asked. I do not know, June said honestly. Over the next few weeks, June tried to return to her normal routine. She went back to work at the train station, continuing to paint the building. But everything felt different now. People treated her differently. They called her a hero. They wanted to hear the story of what happened. Children would come to the station with their parents just to see the woman who had saved the school bus. June found it exhausting. She also found it strangely healing. Every time someone thanked her, every time a parent hugged her and said she had saved their child, something inside her shifted a little. The weight she had been carrying for 5 years became a tiny bit lighter. She started to understand what her therapist had tried to tell her. She could not change the past. She could not bring back the people who had died in the Ridgeway accident. But she could learn from it. She could use her experience to help prevent future tragedies. Maybe that was a kind of redemption. She thought about Mr. Morris's offer, going back to railway work, using her skills again. The thought still scared her, but it also excited her in a way she had not felt in years. She was not ready yet, but maybe someday she would be. For now, she continued painting. She continued her quiet life in Millbrook. But she started to open up a little more. She accepted invitations to have coffee with Rita after her Saturday breakfasts. She started talking to Mrs. Chen about more than just groceries. She even started attending the town council meetings where Tom would give updates on maintenance projects. She was still June Matheson, the quiet painter, but she was also starting to be something more. She was starting to be a person who had survived terrible things and was finding her way back to life. As November turned to December, winter arrived in Millbrook. Snow began to fall, covering the town in white. The trees that had been so brilliant with autumn colors now stood bare against gray skies. People bundled up in heavy coats and scarves. The diner started serving hot chocolate and soup. June finished painting the train station just before the first major snowstorm. Tom Henderson came to inspect her work and declared it perfect. Best the station has looked in 20 years, he said with a smile. He gave her a new assignment for the winter. She would be painting the interior of the town library, which needed fresh walls and trim. The work would be indoors, which was good given the weather. But June found herself missing the train station. She had spent almost 3 months there, and despite everything that had happened, she had grown attached to the place. It had become a part of her routine, her life. One Saturday in mid-December, June walked to the train station just to see it. It was early morning, cold and crisp. Fresh snow crunched under her boots. The station looked beautiful. The gray paint on the railings was clean and new. The white trim around the windows gleamed. Even with snow piling up on the platform, the station had a dignity and charm it had lacked before. June stood on the platform and looked down the tracks. In the distance, she could see the place where the school bus had been stuck. It was just an ordinary railroad crossing now. The snow had covered everything. There was no sign of what had happened there, but June would never forget it. A train horn sounded in the distance. The morning eastbound train was approaching. June stayed on the platform and watched it arrive. It pulled in smoothly, right on schedule. A few passengers got off. Collars turned up against the cold. A couple of people got on. The conductor, a woman June had seen many times over the past months, waved at her. June waved back. The train departed, pulling away from the station and disappearing around the bend. June stood there for a while longer, just feeling the cold air and the quiet of the morning. She thought about all the trains she had controlled in her career. Thousands of trains, hundreds of thousands of passengers, all moved safely from place to place because of the work she and her colleagues had done. One terrible day did not erase all of that. She thought about the envelope Mr. Morris had given her, still sitting on her kitchen table. The commendation from the railway company, the job offer. She was not ready to go back to that work yet. Maybe she would never be ready, but she was starting to think that maybe, possibly someday, she might be. For now, she had a different kind of work to do. Work on herself. Work on healing. Work on learning to live with what had happened and to forgive herself for being human and imperfect. It was hard work, harder than controlling trains or painting railings, but she was doing it. One day at a time. In January, June received a letter. It was addressed to her in neat handwriting and had been forwarded from the railway company. She opened it carefully and found several pages of lined paper covered in the same neat handwriting. It was dated a few weeks earlier. The letter began, "Dear Ms. Matheson, my name is Sarah Collins. You do not know me, but I know about you. I read in the newspaper about what you did in Millbrook, saving the school bus. I wanted to write to tell you what that means to me. 5 years ago, my sister Emma was on the train that crashed near Ridgeway. She was 26 years old. She was going to visit our parents. She died in the crash." June's hands started shaking. She almost put the letter down. She was not sure she could read this. But something made her continue. "I know you were one of the railway controllers on duty that day. I know you blame yourself for what happened. I read the investigation report. I know that many things went wrong that day, and you were one of the people involved. For a long time, I was angry. I was angry at everyone who I thought was responsible for my sister's death. I was angry at you. But time has passed. I have learned more about what happened. I have learned that it was not one person's fault. It was a terrible combination of technical failures and human errors. I have learned that you were doing your best in an impossible situation. And now I have read about what you did in Millbrook, about how you saw danger and you acted, about how you saved those children. I wanted to write to tell you that my anger is gone. I cannot speak for everyone who lost someone that day, but I can speak for myself, and I forgive you. I forgive you for being human, for making mistakes, for not being perfect. And I want to thank you for what you did in Millbrook. Those children went home to their families because of you. Their parents did not have to experience what my family experienced. You saved them from that pain. My sister Emma was a kind person. She was a teacher. She loved children. I think she would be happy to know that you saved those children. I think she would forgive you too. I hope you can forgive yourself. Sincerely, Sarah Collins." June sat in her kitchen, holding the letter, and cried. She cried for Emma Collins and the other 42 people who had died that day. She cried for Sarah and all the families who had lost people they loved. She cried for the 5 years she had spent carrying guilt and shame. She cried for the person she had been before the accident and the person she had become after. And finally, she cried because someone had forgiven her. It did not erase what had happened. It did not make everything okay. But it helped. It helped more than she ever would have imagined. After a long time, June wiped her eyes. She folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer where she kept important things. Then she went to her kitchen table and picked up Mr. Morris's business card. She thought for a while. Then she picked up the phone and called him. When he answered, she said, "Mr. Morris, this is June Matheson. I have been thinking about your offer. I am not ready to go back to traffic control, but I would like to talk about other ways I might use my experience. Maybe in safety training, or in developing better protocols." There was a pause. Then Mr. Morris said, "I think that is an excellent idea. Why do not you come to the city and we can discuss it?" "I will," June said. "Thank you." When she hung up the phone, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt like she had a purpose again. Not the same purpose she had before. She would never go back to being exactly who she had been. Too much had changed, but a new purpose, one that honored what had happened, both the tragedy and the redemption. One that used her experience to help prevent future accidents and to help other people who had experienced trauma. It was not a perfect solution. There were no perfect solutions. But it was a beginning.
By the time spring arrived in Millbrook, June had begun a new chapter of her life. She was still living in her little house on Elm Street. She was still painting for the town maintenance department. But now it was just part-time, a few days a week. The rest of the time, she was working for the railway company as a safety consultant. She traveled to different stations and control centers, helping to train new controllers and to develop better emergency protocols. She shared her experience, both the good and the bad. She talked openly about the Ridgeway accident, about what had gone wrong, and about what had been learned from it. It was hard at first. Every time she told the story, she felt the pain of it again. But it also became a little easier each time, and she saw how her story helped other people, how it made them take safety more seriously, how it made them understand the weight of responsibility they carried. She was also seeing a new therapist, one who specialized in post-traumatic stress. The nightmares had not completely gone away, but they were less frequent now. She was learning techniques to manage her anxiety. She was learning to be gentler with herself. In April, June was invited to speak at a railway safety conference in the city. It was a big event, with hundreds of attendees from railway companies all over the country. June was nervous. Public speaking had never been her strength, and talking about the accident in front of so many people felt overwhelming, but she agreed to do it. She prepared her speech carefully. She wrote about the Ridgeway accident. She wrote about the failures that had contributed to it, both technical and human. She wrote about the aftermath and the trauma. And she wrote about Millbrook and the school bus and how facing her fears had helped her begin to heal. She practiced the speech over and over until she could recite it from memory. On the day of the conference, she stood backstage, her heart pounding, while someone introduced her. When she heard her name called, she walked out onto the stage and stood at the podium. The audience was a sea of faces, hundreds of people, all looking at her. June took a deep breath, then she began to speak. "My name is June Matheson. 5 years ago, I was a senior railway traffic controller, and 5 years ago, I made mistakes that contributed to an accident that killed 43 people." She paused. The room was completely silent. "I am here today to talk about that accident, not to make excuses, not to shift blame, but to share what I learned in the hope that it might help prevent future tragedies." She spoke for 30 minutes. She shared details about what had happened that day. She explained the technical failures and the human errors. She talked honestly about her own mistakes and the burden of guilt she had carried. Then she talked about Millbrook, about the school bus and the freight train, about how using her skills to save people had helped her start to forgive herself. "I will never forget what happened at Ridgeway," she said. "Those 43 people will always be with me. But I have learned that I can honor their memory by using my experience to make our railway systems safer, by helping train the next generation of controllers to be vigilant and careful, by speaking honestly about mistakes so that others can learn from them." She paused and looked out at the audience. "If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Safety is not just about systems and protocols. It is about people, about training them well, about supporting them when things go wrong, about creating a culture where people feel comfortable admitting mistakes and learning from them." When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Then the audience began to applaud. It started quietly, then grew louder. People stood up. The applause continued for a long time. June stood at the podium, overwhelmed. She had expected awkwardness or even hostility. She had not expected this. After the speech, dozens of people came to talk to her. Some were railway workers who wanted to thank her for her honesty. Some were safety officials who wanted her advice. Some were people who had experienced their own traumas and wanted to share their stories. June talked with them all as long as they needed. One woman in particular stood out. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, and she introduced herself as a junior traffic controller.
"I made a mistake last month," the young woman said quietly. "Not a big one. No one was hurt. But it scared me. I have been second-guessing everything I do since then. Your speech helped me understand that mistakes do not mean I am not good at my job. They mean I need to learn and do better." June smiled at her. "That is exactly right. The goal is not to never make mistakes. The goal is to learn from them and to have systems in place that catch them before they become disasters." The young woman thanked her and walked away, looking lighter somehow. June realized that this was what her new purpose looked like, not controlling trains, but helping the people who controlled trains, sharing her hard-won wisdom so that others could benefit from it. It felt right. In June, exactly 5 years after the Ridgeway accident, there was a memorial service for the victims. June had been invited, though she had not been sure she would attend. Sarah Collins had written to her again, encouraging her to come. "I think it would be good for you," Sarah had written, "and I would like to meet you in person." So June made the trip to the city. She put on her best clothes and traveled to the cemetery where many of the victims were buried. It was a beautiful summer day, warm and sunny. A crowd had gathered, maybe 200 people, families of the victims, railway workers, city officials, reporters. There were speeches and prayers, names were read, stories were shared. June stood quietly in the back, listening. She heard about Emma Collins, who had been a third-grade teacher and had loved to garden. She heard about Marcus Chen, a businessman who coached youth soccer. She heard about Maria Rodriguez, a college student who wanted to be a doctor. 43 names, 43 lives, 43 futures that had been cut short. June felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing down on her. But it was different now. It was not crushing her the way it used to. It was simply there, a part of her that she had learned to carry. After the formal ceremony, people mingled. June saw Sarah Collins across the crowd. Sarah saw her too and came over. She was a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair and kind eyes. She looked like someone who had known deep sadness but had found a way through it. "June," she said simply. "Sarah," June replied. They looked at each other for a moment. Then Sarah reached out and hugged her. June hugged her back, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for your letters," June said. "They meant more to me than you can know." "Thank you for what you did in Millbrook," Sarah said. "And thank you for continuing to work in railway safety. Emma would approve." They talked for a while about Emma and about the accident and about how they had both found ways to cope with the grief and guilt. "I visit Emma's grave every month," Sarah said. "I tell her about my life, about my kids, about the world. I like to think she can hear me." "I am sure she can," June said. Sarah smiled. "Would you like to see her grave?" "I am going there now." June nodded. They walked together through the cemetery to a small headstone under a maple tree. The stone read, "Emma Rose Collins, beloved daughter, sister, teacher. May her kindness be remembered always." Sarah knelt and placed flowers on the grave. June stood back, not wanting to intrude, but Sarah gestured for her to come closer. "It is okay. Emma would not mind." June knelt beside her. "Emma," Sarah said softly, "I brought someone to meet you. This is June, the woman I told you about, the one who saved the children." June felt fresh tears welling up. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry for what happened." They stayed there for a while, the two women kneeling by the grave in the summer sunshine. Finally, Sarah stood up. "We should go?" "There is a gathering at my parents' house. Would you like to come?" June hesitated. Meeting the families felt like too much, but Sarah took her hand. "Please, they know who you are. They want to meet you." So June went. Sarah's parents lived in a comfortable house in the suburbs. When June arrived with Sarah, she found about 30 people gathered, all families of victims from the accident. June felt a wave of anxiety. These people had every right to hate her. But when Sarah introduced her, they welcomed her. They shook her hand. They thanked her for coming. They thanked her for what she had done in Millbrook. They told her about their loved ones who had died. And slowly, June realized something. These people did not hate her. They understood that what had happened was complex and tragic. They understood that blame did not bring back the people they had lost. What they wanted was to remember their loved ones, and to know that something good had come from the tragedy, that lessons had been learned, that safety had improved, that other lives had been saved. June could give them that. She spent the afternoon talking with these families. She listened to their stories. She shared what she knew about the accident and what had been learned from it. She talked about the safety protocols that had been implemented because of the investigation. She talked about the children she had saved in Millbrook. When it was time to leave, Sarah's mother hugged her. "Thank you for coming," she said. "And thank you for not giving up, for finding a way to keep going and to use your experience to help others. That is all any of us can do after tragedy." June thanked her and left. As she rode the train back to Millbrook that evening, she thought about the day, about the memorial and the families and the grace they had shown her. She thought about Emma Collins, who had been only 26 when she died, who would never teach another class or plant another garden or grow old. And she thought about the children on the school bus in Millbrook, about how they were alive because she had acted, about how they would grow up and have futures that Emma would never have. It did not balance out. Nothing could balance the scales. But it meant something. June looked out the train window at the passing countryside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The train rocked gently on the tracks, moving steadily toward home. For the first time in 5 years, June felt something close to peace. Over the next year, June's life continued to change and grow. Her work as a safety consultant expanded. she was asked to develop a training program for new railway controllers that incorporated lessons from major accidents, including Ridgeway. She spent months working on the curriculum, making sure it was thorough and practical. When the first group of trainees went through the program, she taught several of the classes herself. She also started a support group for railway workers who had been involved in accidents or near misses. She knew from experience how isolating that trauma could be, how hard it was to talk about with people who did not understand. The support group met once a month, and it became a safe space for workers to share their experiences and help each other heal. In Millbrook, June became more integrated into the community. She went to more town events. She joined a book club that met at the library. She even started dating someone, a quiet man named David who owned the hardware store. It was not serious, but it was nice to have companionship. She still painted part-time for the town. She liked the physical work and the simplicity of it, but it was no longer her entire identity. The nightmares became rare, maybe once every few months now. When they came, June had learned to manage them better. She would get up, make tea, remind herself that she was safe, that the past was past, that she had done good things to balance the mistakes. In the spring of the following year, Tom Henderson retired. The town held a big party for him, and June attended. During his retirement speech, Tom mentioned all the projects he had overseen during his decades of service. When he got to the train station renovation, he paused. "I want to give special thanks to June Matheson," he said, "who did beautiful work on that station. But more importantly, who showed all of us what it means to be alert and responsible and brave. June, thank you for everything you have done for this town." Everyone applauded, and June felt her face turn red. But she also felt proud of the work she had done, both the painting and the saving. After Tom's retirement, June was offered his job as head of the town maintenance department. She was surprised, but after thinking about it, she accepted. It would mean less traveling for the railway work, but she could still consult on major projects and continue teaching. Being in charge of Millbrook's maintenance felt right. It was a way to serve the community that had welcomed her and given her a place to heal. One summer day, June was walking through town when she saw a familiar yellow school bus pull up to the elementary school. Children poured out, laughing and chattering. June recognized the driver. It was the same young man from that day, though he looked older now, more confident. He saw June and waved. She waved back. One of the children, a girl with braids who looked about 8 years old, ran over to June. "Are you the lady who saved the school bus?" she asked. June smiled. "I helped, yes." "My big sister was on that bus," the girl said. "She told me about it. She said you were really brave." "Your sister was brave too," June said. "All the children were. They stayed calm and listened to the adults, which is exactly what they should have done." The girl beamed and ran off to join her friends. June watched the children play for a moment. Then she continued her walk through town. As she walked, she thought about how much her life had changed. 5 years ago, she had come to Millbrook broken and afraid. She had wanted only to hide from the world and from her own guilt. Now she was a functioning member of this community. She had important work to do. She had people who cared about her. She had found a way to live with her past while building a future. It was not the life she had expected to have. It was different from the life she had before the accident. But it was a good life, a meaningful life. June had learned that redemption was not about erasing the past or being forgiven for everything. It was about taking the broken pieces of yourself and slowly, carefully, building something new. Something that acknowledged the pain and the mistakes, but was not defined only by them. She had been a controller who made a tragic error. But she was also the woman who saved the school bus. She was a safety consultant who helped others learn from her mistakes. She was a friend and a community member and a person who was trying every day to do better. That was enough. That was more than enough. As June reached her small house on Elm Street, she paused on the porch and looked back at the town. In the distance, she could hear a train horn. The evening westbound train was approaching the station. She listened to the familiar sound. It no longer filled her with dread. Now it was just part of the landscape of her life, a reminder of where she had been and what she had learned. June went inside and started making dinner. Through the window, she could see her small garden, where tomatoes and lettuce were growing. She could hear birds singing in the trees. She could see the last rays of sunlight painting the sky in soft colors. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary town. And June Matheson, who had once thought she would never feel peace again, was grateful for every ordinary moment of it. Epilogue, 10 years later. June was 61 years old now. Her hair had gone completely white, and she wore reading glasses when she worked at her desk. But she still moved with energy and purpose. She was sitting in her office at the railway company's main training center. On the wall behind her were certificates and awards, including the safety commendation from 10 years ago and several others she had earned since. There were also photographs. One showed her with a group of young controllers at a graduation ceremony. Another showed her at a conference where she had been a keynote speaker. And there was one photograph of the Millbrook train station, freshly painted, looking dignified and proud. June's work had expanded significantly over the past decade. She was now the director of safety training for the entire railway network. She oversaw all the training programs, developed new safety protocols, and investigated accidents and near misses to determine what lessons could be learned. She traveled frequently, teaching and consulting, but she still lived in Millbrook. It was home now. David, the hardware store owner, was her husband of 7 years. They had a comfortable life together. The support group she had started had grown. There were now chapters in multiple cities, helping railway workers across the country deal with trauma and stress. And every year, on the anniversary of the Ridgeway accident, June attended the memorial service. She had become friends with many of the victims' families over the years. They appreciated her honesty and her dedication to preventing future tragedies. Today, June was preparing for a special visitor. A young woman was coming to interview her for a book about railway safety. The woman was a journalist who had been one of the children on the school bus in Millbrook 10 years ago. There was a knock on the door, and June looked up to see a young woman in her early 20s with braids and glasses. She recognized her immediately. "Hello," June said with a smile. "You must be Amanda." "Hi, Ms. Matheson," Amanda said, shaking her hand. "Thank you so much for agreeing to this interview." They sat down, and Amanda pulled out a recorder and a notebook. "I wanted to do this project because of what happened that day," Amanda said. "I was only 12, but I remember it so clearly. How scared we were. How you took charge and got us to safety. It had a big impact on me." "I am glad everyone was safe," June said. "Me too," Amanda said. "And I have been following your career since then. The work you have done in railway safety is remarkable. You have probably saved hundreds of lives with the protocols and training programs you have developed." June felt a familiar mix of pride and humility. "I have had a lot of help." Safety is always a team effort. They talked for over an hour. Amanda asked about the Ridgeway accident and the aftermath. She asked about how June had found the courage to keep working in railway safety. She asked about the support group and the training programs. Finally, Amanda asked, "What would you say to someone who has made a terrible mistake? Someone who is struggling with guilt and does not know how to move forward?" June thought for a moment. I would tell them that guilt is natural, she said slowly. If you have made a mistake that hurt someone, you should feel guilt. That means you have a conscience. That means you care. She paused. But guilt alone is not enough. You have to take that guilt and transform it into something useful. You have to learn from your mistake. You have to do everything you can to prevent it from happening again. And if possible, you have to use your experience to help others. Like you did, Amanda said. Like I tried to do, June corrected. I am not perfect. I still make mistakes, but I try to learn from them, and I try to remember that I am more than the worst thing I have ever done. Amanda wrote this down carefully. One last question, she said. Do you think you have redeemed yourself? For Ridgeway? June considered this. I do not think redemption is something you achieve once and then you are done, she said. I think it is something you work toward every day. Every time I teach a class, every time I help develop a new safety protocol, every time I support someone who is struggling with trauma, I am working toward redemption. She smiled. The people who died in that accident cannot be brought back. Nothing I do will change that, but I can honor their memory by working to make sure fewer people die in accidents in the future. That is the best I can do, and I have to believe it is enough. Amanda nodded. I think it is more than enough, she said quietly. After Amanda left, June sat in her office for a while, thinking about the interview. Thinking about how far she had come from that broken, guilt-ridden woman who had moved to Millbrook 10 years ago. She thought about the 43 people who had died in the Ridgeway accident. She still carried them with her. She still thought about them. But now, instead of just feeling guilt, she felt a sense of responsibility. A responsibility to learn from what happened, to help others, to make the railway system safer. And she thought about the 22 children on the school bus, about Amanda and her classmates, who were now young adults with their whole lives ahead of them, about the difference one moment of courage could make. June stood up and gathered her things. It was time to go home. David would be making dinner tonight, and they were having Sarah and her family over. Sarah visited Millbrook a few times a year now, and she and June had become close friends. As June left her office and walked through the training center, she saw young controllers studying at desks, preparing for their certification exams. She saw instructors in classrooms teaching safety protocols. She saw the whole complex system that kept the trains running safely. And she knew she was part of that system. Not as a controller anymore, but as a teacher and a leader and a voice for safety. It was good work, important work, work that mattered. June stepped outside into the evening air. The sun was setting and the sky was painted with beautiful colors. In the distance, she could hear a train approaching. She stopped and listened to the sound. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails, the distant horn, the steady, powerful movement of the train. It no longer frightened her. It no longer filled her with guilt or anxiety. Now it was just a sound she knew well, a sound that reminded her of her life's work, a sound that represented connection and movement and progress. June smiled and continued walking toward the parking lot where her car waited to take her home to Millbrook, to the small town that had given her shelter when she needed it most, to the place where she had learned that even after terrible mistakes and profound loss, it was possible to heal, possible to grow, possible to find purpose and meaning again. The train passed in the distance, its lights glowing in the twilight. June watched it go, then got in her car and drove toward home, toward the life she had built from the pieces of her broken past. A life of service and redemption, a life of courage and hope, a good life. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.